At breakfast, two children were still holding their spoons when the morning paper put their father's name beside another woman's. Not a stranger. Their mother's friend. Not a name from some party gossip. A widow in black. The children were Debbie Reynolds' children. Their father was Eddie Fisher. And the widow in black was Elizabeth Taylor. Across town, Elizabeth's phone was still ringing with condolence calls for Mike Todd, the husband she had just buried. Eddie came to comfort her. Then he came again. One house had children waiting for a father. The other had a widow answering calls beside an empty chair. Both houses were waiting on the same man. In Debbie's house, breakfast was still on the table. Bowls, spoons, small hands. Children too young to understand why adults had started lowering their voices. The man in the headline was not just a famous singer. He was the father those children expected to see walk through the door. The woman beside his name was not just a movie star. She had once been someone Debbie could trust. The front page needed only 3 names: Elizabeth Taylor, Eddie Fisher, Debbie Reynolds. The papers did not need a family therapist. They needed a headline. That was enough to sell betrayal. The papers made Debbie the wronged wife. They made Elizabeth the woman people were supposed to hate. America liked that arrangement. One woman to protect, one woman to blame. And the man with the wife, the children, and the choice somehow became the quietest person in the room. But Debbie was not reading a movie plot. She was reading her own life. The man in that story still had children in her house. The woman beside his name had once been someone she could trust. Elizabeth's house was not a lover's hiding place at first. It was a house after a funeral. Mike Todd's chair was still empty. His things were still in the house. The calls still came. People called because her husband was dead. After a funeral, friends come by. They call, they stay a little longer. Eddie came the same way. First a call, then a visit, then another visit. Comfort is supposed to leave before dinner. Eddie did not. Then came the longer stays. Then came the hours Debbie could feel but could not stop. Debbie did not lose him in one clean moment. A husband can leave before he packs a bag. He leaves first in attention, in silence, in the way he stops fully coming home. And Elizabeth did not meet Eddie in a hotel room or at a party. She met him in the weeks after Mike Todd's death, while the phone kept ringing and people kept coming to her door. That did not excuse what happened. People were hurt. A friendship broke. A marriage was collapsing. Children were still near the breakfast table when adults outside began turning their father's name into a scandal. But the newspaper could not show both houses at once. It could not show Debbie's bowls and Elizabeth's black dress in the same photograph. It could not show a child waiting for a father and a widow answering condolence calls beside an empty chair. So the public chose the easier picture. Elizabeth Taylor took Debbie Reynolds' husband. A perfect line for a headline. A brutal line for a family. Long before Eddie Fisher, Elizabeth's face had already been placed in front of strangers again and again. Posters, magazine covers, wedding photographs, mourning photographs. By the time this headline appeared, many people did not ask what had happened inside the rooms. They looked at the woman on the page and thought they already knew the story. That way of looking at Elizabeth started before Eddie Fisher, before Debbie's breakfast table, before the black dress after Mike Todd's death. It started with a studio call sheet. Elizabeth Taylor. Call time, stage number, costume, lights. A girl being told where to stand before she was old enough to decide who was allowed to watch her. The call sheet had her name before she had a private life. Elizabeth Taylor. Time, stage, costume, hair, makeup. A child could read her own name on the page, but she did not control what the day would take from her. The adults did. They told her where to stand. They fixed the dress. They turned her face toward the light. They asked her to do it again. To the audience, it looked like a gift. A beautiful girl. Violet eyes. A camera that loved her. Hollywood loved that story because it made everything sound natural. As if fame simply found her. As if beauty was protection. As if a child under lights was the luckiest child in the room. But a studio is not a childhood. A set has marks on the floor. A director has a schedule. A camera has no manners. It comes close when it wants a tear. It waits when it wants a smile. It turns a girl into an image, then sells that image back to millions of strangers. Elizabeth learned early that being watched could feel like being chosen. That lesson is dangerous. A child who is praised for beauty begins to understand how rooms change when she enters. A girl who is filmed before she is fully grown begins to learn that her face belongs partly to people she will never meet. By the time she was old enough to fall in love, the public had already practiced staring at her. It had watched her become a young woman. It had watched her clothes change, her roles change, her body change, her image change. Then the same public acted shocked when it wanted to watch her marriages too. The mistake began here. Not with Eddie Fisher, not with Richard Burton, not with the diamonds, the divorces, or the front pages. It began with a girl learning that privacy was something other people were allowed to interrupt. The studio gave Elizabeth Taylor fame. It also gave her a hunger for a room that belonged only to her. So when the first wedding photograph appeared, people thought they were seeing a fairy tale. They were really seeing a young woman trying to step out of the light. The wedding photograph looked like an escape. Elizabeth Taylor stood beside her first husband in a dress that made the story look finished before it had even begun. A child star had become a bride. The camera girl had found a home. The public could relax. Hollywood had given them a clean picture. But wedding photographs are dangerous. They show the flowers, they show the dress, they show the ring. They do not show the silence after guests leave. They do not show the hotel room when the smile comes off. They do not show a young woman realizing that marriage can become another kind of set. Elizabeth did not marry once because she thought marriage meant nothing. She married again and again because she kept hoping it meant everything. A door, a table, a man who stayed, a life the public could not enter. That hope was already in the first photograph. It was also already in trouble. The world saw a beautiful bride and assumed beauty had made her safe. But beauty had never made Elizabeth safe. It made her visible. It made men want her. It made magazines follow her. It made the public believe her romantic choices belonged to them. The ring did not change that. The suitcase told the truer story. A suitcase means the picture has failed. It means the room that was supposed to protect you has become another place to leave. And once Elizabeth learned that lesson, it followed her. Each new marriage carried the same promise. This time, the door will close. This time, the man will stay. This time, the house will be stronger than the camera outside. But the camera always found the house. A dinner became a photograph. A quarrel became gossip. A separation became a headline. A divorce became a verdict. People later counted her husbands as if they were counting mistakes. They missed the pattern underneath. Elizabeth Taylor was not running from love. She was running toward it too hard. The wedding photograph stayed behind as proof that the public had once believed the fairy tale. The suitcase told what happened next, and soon another version of home appeared. Children, a crib, a quieter room. The kind of room that should have been harder for Hollywood to enter. It was not. The crib sat in the room like a promise. No spotlight, no red carpet, no premiere crowd, just a child's bed, small clothes, bottles, quiet things that belonged to ordinary life. For a moment, Elizabeth Taylor looked less like a woman being watched, and more like a woman building something. A home, a family, a place where the door might finally stay closed. But the telephone was still there. It rang from the other side of the life she wanted. Studio calls, publicity calls, friends, reporters, people who needed the movie star, even when the mother was standing in the room. That was the problem with Elizabeth's homes. They were never just homes. They were places where two lives collided. In one life, a child needed her. In the other, Hollywood did. In one room there were toys. In another, scripts. A mother could be holding a baby while the industry waited for her face. The public saw the glamour and called it privilege. It did not always see the split. A woman trying to be still while the machine kept asking her to move. A family trying to grow while newspapers waited for the next crack. A husband wanting privacy beside a wife whose privacy had already been sold. Elizabeth kept reaching for domestic life, but domestic life had to survive inside the weather of fame. That was not easy for any marriage. It would have been hard even without the grief coming. Then Mike Todd arrived. He did not look like a quiet answer. He was loud, bold, fast, a showman who filled a room before he even sat down. Elizabeth had been adored before. She had been photographed before. She had been desired before. With Mike Todd, she seemed to feel something different. Not displayed. Chosen. That is why his death mattered so much. It did not simply remove another husband from Elizabeth Taylor's life. It ripped out the one marriage that had made her feel, for a brief time, like the spotlight could not swallow her whole. The crib remained, the telephone remained, the house remained. Then the news came. Mike Todd's plane had gone down, and the next man to walk into that grief would not leave alone. Mike Todd's chair did not disappear when he died. That is how death works in a house. The body is gone, the objects stay. A chair, a glass, a jacket, a side of the bed no one is ready to touch. Elizabeth Taylor had lived with cameras almost her entire life, but grief gave her a face the public could not easily package. She was not glamorous in the simple way anymore. She was a young widow. The man she loved was dead in a plane crash. People came softly into the house. They lowered their voices. They brought comfort because that is what friends are supposed to do after a death. Eddie Fisher was one of them. That detail changes everything. He did not arrive first as scandal. He arrived as a familiar man in a grieving room. A voice on the phone, a visit, a presence. Someone close enough to understand the people around Mike Todd. Someone close enough to be dangerous. Debbie Reynolds still had a husband. Her children still had a father. But grief can make a house porous. People come in. Boundaries loosen. A visit that should last an hour lasts longer. A call that should be kind becomes necessary. The person offering comfort becomes part of the day. That is where the damage begins quietly. Not in a hotel, not under a flashing camera, not in the clean sentence the newspapers later used. It begins when one house is broken by death and another starts breaking from neglect. Debbie could feel what the public had not yet named. A husband can leave before he packs a bag. He leaves first in attention, in silence, in the way he stops fully arriving home. The scandal was not only that Elizabeth wanted the wrong man, it was that Eddie let himself become needed in the wrong house. That part should have followed his name more closely. Instead, the world learned the simpler version. Elizabeth Taylor took Debbie Reynolds' husband. A perfect line for a headline, a brutal line for a family. And by the time it reached the breakfast table, the private damage was already done. The next chapter did not begin in Elizabeth's house. It began in Debbie's. Debbie Reynolds' house still looked like a family home. That made it worse. Children's things were still there. Photographs were still there. The ordinary proof of marriage was still sitting in rooms that had not agreed to become famous for betrayal. Outside, the public saw a scandal. Inside, Debbie saw absence. A husband who was not fully home. A father whose name was now tied to another woman's grief. A friend whose face was suddenly printed beside his. That kind of humiliation does not arrive all at once. It gathers. One late call. One explanation that sounds too careful. One silence at the table. One morning when the newspaper says out loud what the house has already begun to feel. The public turned Debbie into the good wife. That may sound kind. It was still another role. Hollywood gave her a clean place to stand. Sweet Debbie. Wronged Debbie. The woman America could defend without ever sitting with her children at breakfast. But Debbie's pain was not a role. It was a home coming apart in real time. And Eddie Fisher was not a prize being stolen from a shelf. He was a man making choices. Every time the story became Elizabeth versus Debbie, Eddie grew smaller in the frame. That was convenient. It let the public turn the scandal into a battle between women. The beautiful temptress, the innocent wife. The old story always sells, but there was a man between them. A husband, a father. A man who walked out of one kind of duty and into another woman's grief. Elizabeth and Eddie eventually stood together in public. That should have made the scandal feel settled. It did not, because a relationship born under that much damage has to live with the sound of how it began. Every dinner carries a ghost. Every photograph carries the old headline. Every attempt at happiness has to step over the family that broke first. Elizabeth may have won the man, but she did not win peace. Eddie could not become Mike Todd. He could not erase Debbie. He could not make the public forget the breakfast table. Then another man appeared under brighter lights. This time the scandal would not wait for the front page. The cameras were already there. The costume was made for a queen, but the room belonged to gossip. Gold fabric, heavy makeup, hot lights, a script page with Cleopatra's name on it. Elizabeth Taylor was supposed to stand before the camera and play a woman powerful enough to ruin empires. Then Richard Burton walked onto the set. He was married. Elizabeth was married. Everyone knew the line. The set knew it too. But movie sets are strange places. They create false rooms where people repeat desire until the body begins to believe it. They put two faces close together. They ask for longing. They ask for heat. They ask for the look that should not last. After the director called Elizabeth and Richard, the look lasted. The studio was already in trouble. The film was expensive. The press was hungry. The world had not forgiven Elizabeth for Eddie Fisher, and now it saw another married man standing across from her. That was enough. A glance became evidence. A pause became a rumor. A photograph became a weapon. The public thought it was watching Cleopatra and Antony. It was really watching two marriages start to burn under studio lights. Elizabeth had been turned into the guilty woman before. The role fit too easily now, a beautiful woman, a married man, a scandal too large to hide. But Richard Burton was not a helpless man pulled by a spell. He chose. He stayed. He returned the look. Still, the camera knew where to aim. At Elizabeth. At her face. At the woman people had already practiced blaming. That is why the Cleopatra scandal became bigger than Fisher. It had everything the first scandal had. But louder. Marriage. Desire. Public outrage. A woman America already distrusted, and this time the affair was born on a set built to be watched. There was no private doorway, no quiet phone call, no breakfast table hidden from view. The world saw the flame while it was still catching. The studio feared disaster. The newspapers smelled money. Elizabeth seemed to believe once again that love might become shelter. But Richard Burton did not bring shelter. He brought a storm that knew how to pose for photographs. The diamond arrived like a headline you could wear, large enough to stop a room, bright enough to make a camera forget the face behind it. That was how the Burton years often looked from the outside. Jewels, yachts, hotel suites, airport photographs. Two stars moving through the world as if ordinary life had been made for other people. The public called it romance, because romance is easier to watch than damage. A diamond does not show the fight after midnight. A yacht does not show the silence between two people who have said too much. A hotel balcony does not show the child waiting behind a door for the adults to become gentle again. Elizabeth and Richard loved each other loudly. That much was clear. They also hurt each other loudly. The world turned the noise into legend. They married, they fought, they left, they returned, they divorced, they married again. People called it passion. Sometimes it was. But passion is not the same as a safe home. A safe home does not make everyone wait for the next explosion. A safe home does not turn apology into theater. A safe home does not need diamonds big enough to distract from the damage. Elizabeth had spent years reaching for a room that could hold her. With Richard, the room became famous too. Their love did not hide from the camera. It performed back. That made the story irresistible. It also made it harder to see the cost. Children were not standing outside this life. They were near it, near the departures, near the returns, near the headlines adults pretended were only about adults. The public saw the gift. The family saw the weather. A diamond could say he loved her. It could not promise peace. A second wedding could say they had not finished. It could not undo the first ending. That was the trap. The more spectacular the love became, the less anyone asked whether it was livable. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton became one of the great romances of the century. But greatness is not comfort. Sometimes it is only damage with better lighting. And while the world watched the lovers, another part of the story kept being pushed outside the frame. The children. The school bag did not belong in the legend. That is why it matters. It belonged to the ordinary part of Elizabeth Taylor's life, the part the public kept stepping over. Children do not experience scandal as headlines. They experience it as weather in the house. A door closing too hard. A mother crying behind another door. A new man at breakfast, a familiar man gone, a photographer outside, a question at school, a silence adults hope the children will not understand. Elizabeth loved her children. That must stay in the story. This is not the story of a woman without a heart. It is the story of a woman whose search for love kept shaking the homes around her. The public counted husbands, children counted changes. Those are different numbers. A marriage announcement might last one day in the papers. A child lives with the new room, the new rules, the new absence. The next adult everyone has to adjust around. Elizabeth wanted family. Again and again, she tried to build it. That is what makes the story more painful, not less. She was not rejecting home. She was chasing it with the force of someone who had never fully owned one. The camera had entered early. The studio had entered early. The public had entered early. By the time her children arrived, the door had already been damaged. So the family had to live inside a fame that kept inviting strangers in. The Burton years made that impossible to ignore. The romance was too loud, the fights too visible, the reconciliations too tempting for the press. People praised the passion because they did not have to sleep under its roof. Children did. That is the cost hidden behind the phrase love scandal. It sounds adult. It sounds glamorous. It sounds like something that belongs to movie stars, not school mornings. But every scandal has an afterlife. Someone has to sit at the table after the headline. Someone has to answer the phone. Someone has to grow up near the story. Strangers think they understand. And when the old front pages began to fade, Elizabeth Taylor was still left with the question that had followed her since childhood. Could any private life survive once the world believed it had the right to look inside? The old front page still knows how to hurt, even after the marriage is ended, even after the apology softened, even after the people in the story grew older and the photographs began to yellow. The sentence still works. Elizabeth Taylor fell for her best friend's husband. It is short. It travels easily. It gives the public a villain before the story has time to breathe. That is why it lasted. Not because it was complete, because it was simple. It left out Debbie's breakfast table. It left out Mike Todd's empty chair. It left out Eddie Fisher's responsibility. It left out the children who had to live in houses adults made famous for breaking. It left out the little girl under studio lights, learning that strangers could look at her before she understood how to stop them. None of that makes Elizabeth innocent. People were hurt. A friendship was broken. A marriage collapsed. Children carried consequences they did not choose. But the clean version still lies by being too clean. Hollywood said it was defending marriage while selling the collapse. It said Elizabeth was shameless while using her face to keep the story alive. It blamed the woman most visible on the page and let the man between two homes become almost secondary. That was not morality. That was entertainment. Elizabeth Taylor spent her life inside that bargain. The public wanted her beautiful, then punished her for being desired. It wanted her romantic, then mocked her for marrying. It wanted her pain, then judged the way she survived it. By the end, the great love scandal was not only about Eddie Fisher, Debbie Reynolds, or Richard Burton. It was about a woman who had been watched so long that the world mistook access for ownership. The first newspaper at Debbie's door made one family's pain public. But the habit began earlier, on a studio set, under a hot light, with a young girl being taught to stand still while strangers looked closer. That is the colder story beneath the scandal. Elizabeth Taylor kept trying to find a home. Hollywood kept turning the door into a headline.